Everybody, good morning. Several hours ago, and here we are. It's evening time. We've had some cocktails, and I think we're in for a really great conversation to cap off our day of celebrating Barbara Oberg. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a few moments. I see some new faces in the audience, and also some who've been around all day too, but to maybe say a few more things about Barbara. Some things that maybe haven't been said, and also maybe some things she herself didn't share with all of us in her comments a few minutes ago. So Barbara's career really began in intellectual history, and it's wonderful to see how her research has really informed a lot of her career and scholarship. She has her PhD from UC Santa Barbara, where she studied intellectual history, especially the Enlightenment. Her dissertation was The Progress towards the Perfection of Man, David Hartley and the Association of Ideas, where she studied the interplay of science, politics, and religion during the Enlightenment. And so when you think about her career from there and the immersion that she had in the papers of Philip Matzay, Albert Gallatin, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, you get to know a lot about Barbara's own scholarly and intellectual interest and how dynamic and expansive they really are. Her time as a documentary editor for the Franklin and Jefferson papers constituted almost 30 years of efforts. And during that time, she made available for scholars more than 20 volumes of material. And not only did she make it available, but one of the things that I think we learned today from hearing how people have used this material, it's not just the text that she made available, it's all the research and scholarship that went into every single letter that was published. It's an absolutely astonishing contribution to the body of knowledge. So, congratulations. And she has helped change how we understand the past, and she's allowed us to ask fundamental questions about who we are as a nation and who we have been. But she's been more than that. She's also been a leading figure in the field of documentary editing and also in early American studies. She was the president of the Society of the Historians of Early American Republic, and there's the current president here with us today, and also several past presidents in the audience. And this is the premier society for historians who study the early republic. She was also the president of the Society of Textual Scholarship and the president of the Society for Documentary Editing, winning the Julian P. Boyd Award for distinguished contributions to American history and culture. She's an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society in 2004. She's an elected member of the Society of American Historians, which recognizes distinguished contributions to history and literature. And she's been a member of the American Philosophical Society since 1998. Barbara has also made a point to make service a key part of what she has done, often through voluntary efforts. And I had a long list of all the committees and boards that she served on. I just want to mention three for us tonight. The first is serving on the board of Colonial Williamsburg from 2006 to 2014, and we're going to hear from the CEO of Colonial Williamsburg soon. She was on the Omohundro Institute board since 2010 and serving as its chair from 2014 until this year. She also has been very active here at the American Philosophical Society, an institution founded by Franklin and I think really given new energy by Jefferson in the early republic. And there's probably no person better suited to help guide an institution with those two individuals than Barbara and her own knowledge and experience. So I want to list to you all of the committees that she served on here at the APS, because we are a body of academics, which means we are run by committees, right? Took you a little while to get that, right? But the truth is, our members are elected for distinguished careers advancing knowledge, and the committees are composed of these members so that the society can aspire to the highest ideals of excellence. And so it's probably no surprise that the society asked Barbara to serve on so many to ensure that excellence is continued. So here goes. She was on the Committee on Meetings from 1999 to 2008, and from 2015 to 2021. She was on the Committee on Publications from 2000 to 2010. She was on the Council, which is our board, from From 2002 until 2021, so for almost 20 years, she was on our council. She was on the committee for nominations of officers, the class committee on membership, the committee on library, where she was my chair from 2019 to 2021. And I should add, our bylaws say you can only be the chair of this committee for 6 years. We found a loophole to make sure she could do it for 12. But more than that, and I think one of the things that we've realized today with all of the stories we've shared is that she helped mentor a whole range of people in a variety of different ways. It was really revealing when Alyssa Pennick talked about how she'd never met Barbara Oberg, but the introduction that Barbara wrote for her most recent edited volume really helped her as a graduate student, and this was her first time getting to meet her. We heard Jim Ambuski talk about happening to sit next to Barbara Oberg and having her give him just a couple words of encouragement that to him meant all the world. We have all the representatives from the Thomas Jefferson papers with us today, all the employees. That's 10 years almost after Barbara retired from the Jefferson papers, who made an effort to come here today to honor her. So she has been an incredible mentor, and I just want to share my own personal experience, which Barbara may not really remember fully, because it's been a long time. But the first time I met Barbara was similar to Jim, where we were at an Omohundro Institute conference, and she invited me to sit next to her on a bus. And I sat next to her, and she said, well, I really want to learn more about you. I hear you're getting a job at Williams College, and her daughter happened to be at Williams College. And we had this great conversation, and then after that, Barbara emailed me before the AHA and said, I'd love to continue our conversation. Do you want to get together? I have a really full schedule, but I do have time for breakfast. Are you a morning person? And I haven't told her this till now, but I'm not a morning person. But I took that breakfast meeting because it was Barbara Oberg, you know? And after that, she would email me before a lot of conferences and say, are you coming to this conference? I'd love to meet you. You're the only other morning person I know. But then here at the APS, as I mentioned, Barbara served on the committee that oversaw the library. And when I was hired as librarian, I was 37 years old. It was a big step to go from being a professor at Williams to a job like this. And I can't tell you how incredible she was to provide me with support, advice, confidence to lead. And I just want to take a moment to thank her for that. And when I think about her whole career, if there's one thing that I think unites it all, from being a documentary editor who dedicated her time to making things available to others, to committing her time and energy to all these organizations, and to mentoring so many people, many of whom are in this audience today, I think the defining aspect of Barbara Oberg's career has been a dedication to making a better future and an incredible generosity of spirit. So thank you, Barbara. So it's in that spirit that we organized this panel conversation, which is looking at the future of cultural organizations, especially organizations dedicated to collections, to preservation, and to history. And to moderate that event, we asked the most recent APS president, Linda Greenhouse. And Linda, many of you probably know Linda from her work, but if not, she spent 40 years at the New York Times, 30 of which she covered the Supreme Court. In 1998, she received the Pulitzer Prize in journalism. She was elected to the APS in 2001, and she served as its president from 2017 to 2023. Linda?
I'll sit here in the middle. Those of you who heard this morning that Thomas Jefferson was president of the APS for 17 years, and I was president for only 6. Now we have term limits, so just want to make that clear. So our topic is the needs and opportunities of leadership of cultural institutions. And the two leaders who are going to join me in this conversation are Sasha Suda, who is the George Widener Director and CEO of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and Cliff Fleet, who is President and CEO of Colonial Williamsburg. I'm going to take Patrick's model from the earlier panel and not give their bios, except very, very quickly. Sasha's previous job was as director of the National Art Museum of Canada. I asked her earlier whether she was sorry to have left Canada, but we'll leave that aside. And she took her new job just this past September. And Cliff Fleet is a longtime businessman and service on many boards. Has about 25 degrees from William and Mary. Only
Not quite
four,
that many,
not quite.
only four, yeah.
Only 4 academic degrees from William and Mary. So our discussion really grows kind of organically out of the last 2 panels, I think, the Jefferson panel and then the final conversation, because my takeaways from those are, for one thing, how fraught history is today, and then also the questions about how we present history to the public, whether it's art history or colonial history or any kind of history. And these have never been simple questions, but I think it's probably safe to say they've never been tougher questions than they are right now, as captured by ripped from this morning's news, the headline on a story in this morning's New York Times, which says, I quote, the headline, "Leading a museum isn't only about art. It's about so many other things." And by museum, I also include a site like Colonial Williamsburg. So many other things that the story says. The leader of such an institution has to be an octopus, has to have so many arms to take account of all the obligations. So to start our conversation, I'll just make a couple of observations, which is that, at least on the surface, your 2 institutions are obviously quite different, but they have many things in common. For one thing, you're both quite new at your jobs. Both your institutions depend on the kindness of strangers, those who give money, those who decide to spend their free time with you, getting people in the door. And both, more to our point right now, face changing expectations, rapidly changing expectations of the role of a cultural institution in today's America, expectations that require decisions about whose stories get told and who tells them. What stories do you foreground? We heard from Monticello earlier, and I went to Monticello, as everybody did, many, many years ago as a kid, and then I went again last year. And boy, what a difference in what story gets told. It was really head-snapping and thrilling, actually. And you know, we tell our stories directly as interpreting history in Colonial Williamsburg, and some of you may have read the fabulous story in the New York Times last month about the changes that Cliff has made at Colonial Williamsburg. I told him you couldn't pay for a story like that, and of course, the Times doesn't require money to write a good story, so he did not pay for that story. But it appeared on May 9th, in case any of you want to check it out. The headline on that piece was "Telling Early America's Whole Story," emphasis on the whole. And again, I went to Colonial Williamsburg as a child, as we all did, and I've been back many times since, most recently maybe about a year ago. And boy, that's a different story that's being told there. So the really challenge is embracing the past, obviously, not negating the past, honoring the past while embracing the present. So why don't we just talk about mission in light of the great reckoning of 2020 and the new realizations that we all have about what is the whole story. So maybe, Cliff, I'll start with you. I mean, how would you define the mission of Colonial Williamsburg?
One of the first things we did, at least when I arrived there, was to essentially remind ourselves or recenter ourselves about why we exist as an organization and why we were created. And if you go back and read the original documents that the founders of Colonial Williamsburg wrote to each other, it was all about education. And of course, we're a very large, complex organization with hotels and restaurants, and we're a major employer and, economic driver. But our purpose is education. And our purpose is to tell the story of our nation at the time of the revolution, when these very complex things that people have been doing a wonderful job of talking about today came together. The beauty of Williamsburg as a place, unlike this magnificent city in Philadelphia or Boston, Williamsburg had no economic reason to be. It was created to be the capital of Virginia. And then when the capital was moved to Richmond because the British showed up and we didn't have boats and they did, we decided to move inland in Virginia. The city was essentially frozen in time. So it didn't develop. And so what you had were what we have almost 100 colonial era structures, and then the city was restored to look like it did at the time of the revolution. The beauty of it, though, is it's actually the place where it happened. We're not a museum in a city that has to figure out what to bring in. All we have to do is actually look in the buildings, use material culture, use architecture to uncover the stories that are already there. And this was a city that was an incredibly complex place. Over half of the population was black. There were natives who were in and out of the city all the time in terms of trading. And so what we've really done over the past few years is think about our nation's pending anniversary in 2026, which also beautifully for us is our 100th anniversary in the same year. And think about what are the stories that we need to tell that may have been ignored or not told in our history. And so we have elevated and found those stories and have brought them forth. And I'll talk about this later. We can do it in a way that actually brings people together. And that's what we've seen in terms of our work that we've done, and that's what's guiding the work that we do today.
And Sasha, I'll give you the same challenge. What's the mission of the PMA?
Right.
Well, now entering my 8th month there, I'll say that it's a mission that's truly rooted in, late 19th century models of bringing the world to a place that maybe doesn't have full access to it. Founded with the World's Fair here, 1876. You had, the basis of the collection then being Chinese pottery and architecture from far away, and over time added to that amazing old masters' paintings and filled out that story of what I'd call the grand tour.
And I think I told you when we met on Zoom a couple of weeks ago, I think I told you the first time I ever was at the museum was soon after I had finished a college course in 20th century painting and sculpture, and it had a big emphasis on the Dada and Surrealist artist, and there they were, right out of my textbook. It was like, whoa. So,
absolutely, we go deep.
Yeah.
We go, right. We go deep. And so when we moved from the fairgrounds to the building that we're in now, we took on the challenge of filling in those gaps and really becoming the city's museum, even in name and in function. So if you read our mission today, it's quite long. It's several lines, if not sentences. I'd say it's equally weighted between custodial care of a collection and art appreciation and education. And how we define education, I would say, has been historically through bringing art to young people and to underrepresented communities and to giving people access to that beauty and those histories.
So of course you can't educate unless you get people to come and look and engage. And how does a big museum up on a hill do that in today's urban world?
Well, I would say, what we're working on now, what we're hearing from from the communities that we exist for. And the charge I inherited from our amazing board chair, Leslie Ann Miller, was we can't assume that we're entitled to that audience. We need to meet people where they are and really truly become the city's museum in today's terms, and approach the work that we do and our own mission with increasing amounts of humility and understanding that, there's a lot we don't know about the world outside of our four walls, and even about the world we've created within our four walls. And so I would say, if I could, foresee a future with a new mission, it would be, there would be a slight chiropractic adjustment or a recentering of gravity around service and reciprocity.
What does that mean, service?
Well, it means you fundamentally believe that you exist in service of others and not in service of yourself. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, we're there in service of a collection, absolutely. But that collection doesn't exist to drive our own research projects and to underpin the narratives that we've committed to, but it's in service of broader society. And it really hinges on the fact that we're not to the side of society, but that we're part of it and that we reflect it in real time, that every day we're growing and learning, and that we'll talk about the octopus part, that no matter what's going on within these institutions as they transform, that everyone finds joy and purpose in getting outside of that and becoming a part of society that is a beacon for hope and optimism, for connection, for learning, feeding curiosity, and so on.
So both of you tell your stories through objects, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
People in costumes,
Yeah.
in
Objects,
gear,
structures, people.
structures.
People, yeah.
And you've done a fair amount of literally uncovering, right?
Literally,
digging
yeah.
and discovering. And talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so that's what I described earlier. That's the beauty of Colonial Williamsburg. All we really have to do is turn over some dirt, and we literally uncover, history right there. And in fact, the Today Show, Craig Melvin was on site in Colonial Williamsburg yesterday, and there's going to be a piece on the Today Show about some of the work that we're doing. Two projects that we have gotten good coverage for that I think help immensely in terms of telling a story. One of those is, of course, the story of First Baptist Church. This church is, though we'll need scholars to fully verify this, was founded in 1776 in Williamsburg, which makes it likely the oldest church in the country founded by blacks for blacks. It's a church that still exists today. In fact, the bell was used to open the new African American History Museum in the nation's capital, and the bell was restored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. One of the first projects I did when I went there, the site of the first permanent structure of the church exists in Colonial Williamsburg, and I went to the church, and this was actually pre any George Floyd or anything. It was one of the first things I did, pre-actually COVID. And I asked, and we had a meeting and said, can we do some work on this site and see what we can learn? And we reached agreement to do that, and we actually agreed that we were going to be the model for the nation in terms of how you do descendant-driven research, as we do and uncover the history of this church. And it has been a remarkable site for us, both in terms of what we have learned. For example, we've uncovered 63 graves that we did not know existed previously on the site. We uncovered the original foundation of the church, which was, we believe, built by the enslaved members of this church. And we're going to reconstruct it in advance of the church's 250th anniversary in 2026. Well, this is history that previously had not been told and had not been understood. And it's an interesting intersection about how you can bring people together. Because we're obviously doing archaeology, and we found lots of material in the ground from early parishioners of the church, which is now in our labs, and it'll take about a year to go through all that material. but also people in the community and members of the church have actually started to bring forth documents and other things that they had in their homes and in Bibles and other things like that, that has really brought people together in really, really powerful ways in the community. We've stated from the beginning it's been a descendant-driven thing, but it's been done in a way that brings us together as opposed to pushes people apart. It's been a remarkably powerful project, I think, for us, and we hope for the nation as we get closer to that church's anniversary.
I mean, back in the day when probably most of us first encountered Colonial Williamsburg, it would have been entirely possible to spend, 3 days there with no awareness that there had been a black population, right, that there was still a black population. Right. Just as, somebody could have gone through the museum with the old masters and the Chinese porcelain and not have any idea of other kinds of art being made in the world. So the motto of the APS is promoting useful knowledge.
Right.
So, all knowledge, I guess, is useful to somebody, but you're both trying to find, trying to extract knowledge that speaks to today's society, right? Takes money, takes resources, takes prioritizing, which means taking away from something else. So in terms of collecting in the curatorial aspect of the museum, what's being done at the price of what?
That's one of the most important questions. And I think that is one of the key questions we have to address again and again, and in some ways try to avoid as we make these changes, because it can't feel like it's one at the cost of another. I think the whole team has to buy into these narratives of change and feel like they can contribute to them in some way. And I suppose a good example recently at the PMA is that on my second day at the museum, or fourth day maybe, and you may remember we were in a strike, so it was a volatile time. One of our board members, Ira Brind, approached me and said, look, I have a collection of African art. I'd like to support its going to the PMA, and I also think that there could be a way to support its study across time, not just as a historical collection, but thinking also about diasporic African communities. And I think that makes sense in Philadelphia today. And I said, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And so I went back to the museum just to do some, obviously, due diligence and find out, how can it be that as a museum in a city where half the population identifies as African American does not have those cultural histories represented in its biggest visual arts institution when we call ourselves an encyclopedic museum. And in fact, it wasn't that simple. We have been collecting the art of African American artists. We've been keeping safely in storage a number of extraordinary classical African objects, sculptures. But those are in the care of, for example, the European department, because in the early days of creating structures in museums, that made sense. Now those curators are really uncomfortable engaging this material, given the sort of constructs, colonial constructs that it calls up and out in the outward-facing messaging. And then in other areas like works on paper and places where they were programming, but not maybe from a perspective of lived experience, and felt like without that representation on the staff, without that expertise, there wasn't, they didn't have the support they needed to do the work. So I was able to go back to Ira and say, this is great, let's do it. And that's really all it took, was the friendly ear of a chair who was saying, go for it, a board who was open to it, and a very, very generous gift to underwrite this new Center for African and African Diasporic Art. But of course, as we rolled it out, it does make other people uneasy, right? I mean, suddenly everybody's sort of through an authentic smile going, what does this mean for my space in the museum? And then I have advocates for the center saying, well, we don't want to be in the basement. We deserve to be where the old masters are. And I think the beauty of this is, through the transformation of an institution, you have those conversations together without abandoning one another. And by the end, you hope that people don't feel like they had to give something up. In fact, they feel like they've created space for something that makes everything we do more relevant.
I mean, is it a question, I guess, for both of you, kind of meeting your audience where they are, or challenging your audience to think of, you know, their received wisdom in a different way?
There was some conversation in some of the earlier panels about history and how do you present it, and do you challenge, and do you make it, I'm going to use these words, too bright or too dark, or how do you do that? So last year, we actually did a quantitative survey of the nation to ask that question, ask questions like that about how do you present history, how do we need to think about history, and obviously we did this with a public lens. And we made sure that we covered geographies, so across the country, and we also covered political viewpoints. So everything from far left to far right to the middle. And actually what we found, well, first of all, we found that Colonial Williamsburg is a national brand and is trusted, so that was really good to uncover, both by right or left, so that was fantastic news for us. But what we found was, for the vast majority of people, I'm going to say 90%, so you can exclude the 5% on the far left and the far right, or the far right and the far left, I'm not trying to judge either one, who want you to essentially use history as a tool to achieve some kind of other objective. The vast majority of people said, just tell me what happened. Okay? Just tell me what happened. Don't try to hide anything. Don't try to cover anything up. Make it a full and complete story. But more importantly, also tell me how you know that. Okay? Yeah. Tell me how you know that, so that I know that it can be trusted. And of course, you know, what makes us, I think, special for me is, you know, we obviously do work in archaeology and historic, and we have incredible collections and partnerships with Omohundro and others to advance knowledge, and then how do we translate that for people? And we have millions of visitors per year. We have to do that, and also millions of people we reach online. And so the trick is, how do we then take that knowledge and present the facts in a full and complete way? And also tell people how we know what we know, because that is actually what is really, really important today. Yeah, and that's the path through this. That's the path.
And that message came through some of the earlier panels, yeah. I think, kind of show your work.
Yeah.
Show your work.
Because there's such skepticism in the public now about messages that come on from on high, from you know, famous institutions. Yeah, how do we know what we know? And I mean, you've got the physical, you've got a construction site.
Well, yeah, how do we know? Well, there it is. We just uncovered it yesterday, right?
Yeah,
you know,
right,
I mean, it's.
Right.
Yeah.
And how does the museum show its work?
Well, it's you know, and I will say about this show your work, I think it's a really basic, common sense way also to connect across generations.
Yeah.
Because we hear increasing cries for transparency from younger staff. We want credibility with our older audiences as we go through change. So I completely agree, and I'm highly optimistic that if we do this, we will get where we want to go, even as a society. I have an example that is a fun one about the painter Vermeer, who you may have been reading about in the last few weeks, has had a major show in Amsterdam at the Rijksmuseum, probably the first and last time in our lifetimes that his work will be brought together in such a large group. Very mysterious figure. And he's linked to a painting that's in storage at the PMA Sometimes it's been called a Vermeer, other times it's a copy of a Vermeer, sometimes a copy by a later person, but more generally accepted as a contemporary 17th century copy of a Vermeer that's in Kenwood House in London. So about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, we got a heads up that at the Vermeer conference in Amsterdam, on the occasion of this big exhibition, they would be presenting a paper with the title, Vermeer in Philadelphia, a very sad story. And as you can imagine, it sent our team in a bit of a tailspin, because they read into it that we're being accused of, doing harm to this work, which in fact entered our collection as part of the John G. Johnson collection over 100 years ago, the product of a pretty aggressive cleaning. And, when you clean a painting that has been painted in oil or tempera at many layers, you can clean the life out of it, right? You can go from a very multi-dimensional painting to being quite flat. And so that's sort of the state in which it exists. But the public loved this story. CNN picked it up, the art newspaper. And so I said to the team, let's not be defensive, because we've got all the proof that it came to us this way, but why not engage in a conversation about what we do behind closed doors? Mm-hmm. And if people want to see the painting, let's show them the painting. And I have to admit, it didn't take much encouragement. It was installed yesterday, so you can see it with your own eyes. And I think we've gotten some feedback on Facebook and other places where people take their smartest commentary and some vehement beliefs that this should be restored and so on, and you can't hide from that. And I'm really excited for the conservators to be able to tell that story and show what they do behind closed doors, even when it doesn't meet the highest aesthetic standards with which we associate ourselves, but nevertheless gives us an opportunity to tell people what we do and why we exist.
In a way, it kind of humanizes the institution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To say, yeah. So before we turn it over to the audience, I do want to talk maybe at some length about the issue that came up in the last conversation, 2026. Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned earlier, Cliff, it is the centennial of Colonial Williamsburg, as well as the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. So it's, I can't top Annette Gordon-Reed in talking about it. It's a different 2026 than it would have been, than one would have anticipated back in 1976, when, I remember, old enough to remember, watching the parade of the tall ships come up the Hudson mm-hmm. River from the top floor of the World Trade Center.
Wow.
So that's a memory.
Yeah.
But here we are in 2023, so you must have some kind of notional planning going on.
It's more than notional for us.
So what's the story going to be?
Well, I think the first thing, at least we don't view 2026 as the event. Okay, the nation was formed, and where's Mary Beth Norton? She's in this room somewhere. You wrote the definitive work that said it was in 1774 that we started to think about ourselves as a people. It wasn't that year, and there was a journey that led up to 2026. Of course, the war had started long before 1776, and then there was a journey during the war, and then the formation of the country that led to the Constitution. And so we've talked a lot about those themes today. So we need to think about how do we leverage this moment in a way that will bring us together and I think address some of the history and civics crisis that a lot of us have spent a lot of time thinking about. I think what it's going to be very helpful about the time is that for whatever reason, we as a nation, whenever it ends in a zero, we tend to get more interested in it from an anniversary standpoint. So there's going to be a lot of interest in terms of this. And so the question is, what do we do with that interest and how do we leverage that and get ourselves out there? I am more optimistic than maybe some of the earlier presenters, and I'll just tell one story. 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, I lose track of time, I was in inner city LA schools. And you say, well, why was he there? And that's because we at Colonial Williamsburg actually train thousands of teachers every year about how to teach history. And over the course of this Teachers Institute program, we've done well north of 30,000 teachers that have gone through our program. And we do thousands of teachers every year. And so I was out in LA witnessing what happens for teachers who've been trained in terms of how they can teach history. And so I was in a room probably twice as big as this, full of fifth graders, who were asking questions of our interpreters portrayed Thomas Jefferson, Martha Washington. Can you tell me about your differences between John Adams and yourself as you led up to? Talk about what it was like to be a female at the time of the Revolution. And I can go on, but you get the idea. And in fact, our interpreter who plays Thomas Jefferson, who was portraying Thomas Jefferson in front of this group, actually stopped in the middle of it and said, I've got to stop and give your teachers a round of applause. And this was a room that demographically looked nothing like this. And I'm not just talking about age. 80% of this group was historically a minority, okay, who were deeply engaged in what it meant to be an American, in our history, and that was in LA. And so I am optimistic that if we all focus on this issue, we can make a difference in terms of what happens here. Because I saw it. I saw it just 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sasha, do you have 2026 plans, or you're
I'm really like basking in the sunlight that is Cliff right now.
Yeah, right.
Very, very beautifully said and
Yeah.
and incredibly on point. So we do have plans. Some of them are public, some of them are not.
Right.
We've made a decision to be deeply authentic about who we are within this city and the arts, visual arts landscape. We will be presenting work, for example, a big exhibition of Marcel Duchamp, and one might ask, what does Marcel Duchamp have to do with the 250th birthday of this country and the 150th anniversary of the museum? And that is, he has become one of the foundational figures of our history and of, for example, your experience there and the experience of many others. And programming around that exhibition in ways to ask, what does that mean today? What have artists gone on to do as a result of their experience with his work in our institution, the largest collection outside of France? And what does that mean about being an artist in America in 2026? And we'll be doing a show on arts and crafts, hearkening back to the origins of the institution. And connecting that to the very much what is the heart of craft here in Philadelphia today, and the contemporary art scene. And then we have some really exciting plans around the American Art Collection and telling that story in a way generously to engage publics in a way perhaps we haven't before.
Oh, I can hardly wait.
So
That's gonna be fantastic, yeah.
we're pulling together a lot of things that
Yeah.
people had on their minds.
Right.
And trying to, make a quilt together for the first time.
Wow.
Well, I know there's plans underway here that are maybe information also, right? It's going to be an exciting time to be in Philadelphia, certainly, and
We hope Williamsburg too. We just want a little bit of the sunshine that Philadelphia is going to get.
so we have not too much longer, and we're what stands between you and, at least for some of us, dinner. So let me turn it over to you all for, I see a hand there, but wait for the mic, for your responses or questions. Oh, Bob Hauser.
Yeah, as I follow this discussion, much of it has to do with the efforts on your part and the desirability of bringing members of minority populations into your institutions. So my question is whether what you have been doing so far has been successful in that, and whether you have metrics for learning whether you have in fact been successful in doing that?
Go ahead. Or I can, yeah.
Well, we're very much, no, it's a
Yeah.
great question. I think it's really important that there be metrics to measure our success. And, it would be anecdotal at this point to share that, but I'd love to come. Yeah, but I'd be happy to come back and report later. I'll say that given the demographic breakdown of the city, I would hope that we can have an audience, a broader audience that feels better represented within the institution and thereby, more motivated to come and visit with us and be part of it.
I would, for us, first of all, for those of you who've been to Williamsburg, we're an open campus. So most of the people who visit don't buy a ticket, which is okay with us because that means we're enabling people, to visit and learn without having to create barriers for people, although we do have ticketed in some buildings and structures. At this point, I think some of the early signs are encouraging, but we have a long way to go, just to be very frank. And I think that that's something that most cultural institutions face, but I'm optimistic as we go forward over the next few years. We will make progress there. I know that the African American community and the Native community, which is obviously a big piece of what we do, are working very closely with us to make sure that we're viewed as a place that all people are welcome because we're telling all of the stories and all of the histories. We had a African American museum come down last week, and I spent a day with them from upstate New York. And one woman who was there as their historian had said, I came to CW as a child, everybody does. And she said, quite frankly, I didn't view it as a place for me. And she said, now that's completely different. And so we're optimistic that as our work continues, that the visitation and the message will shape and change. We also have to think about digital education, which is probably not enough time to talk about today, but that is really going to be an avenue to reach younger audiences, and that's a big push for us. Yeah, there was a question back there.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, since it's also your 100th anniversary, if you're planning to show your work, as it were, to bring people into the history of the place as opposed to just the history of the time.
Yeah. Many people may not realize that we actually run a very large indoor museum in Williamsburg with very large collections, both art and furniture and et cetera. And so we're going to take a piece of our own museum to tell our own history. We also have to write a book, so we've got about 5 or 6 books we're going to publish over the next few years. One of the books is going to be about ourselves and about our own history as we approach that. And thankfully, all of that has been very generously funded by donors in terms of our work.
Hi, I'm George Boudreau. While I've been following Dr. Oberg intellectually for more than 30 years, primarily these days I'm a public historian, so I've gotten to have lots and lots and lots of interaction with your institutions. I told Sasha, you gave me the book illustration for the penultimate book I edited, and Cliff, I have to tell you, I'm thrilled to hear you. I was the Omohundro Jamestown postdoc in 2018, and your staff was not at their happiest. So hearing your description of Williamsburg's mission is very heartening for me. So I need to ask you to invite me back so I can talk to them some more. I'm currently, please God, finishing a book on interpreting historic sites and I would just point out that Williamsburg has always been tremendous on the cutting edge. I think my first adult visit to the place, I got to see Christy Coleman, who has gone on to great fame now, doing first-person interpretation in one of the houses as an African-American enslaved woman. And she was ramrod strong against people who really wanted to hear Uncle Remus asking her, did she sing and dance at the end of her workday? And did she teach her children slave songs? And it was painful to me, and I stayed afterwards to compliment her and bond. But I mean, I guess I would argue with Bob, since I'm someone who spends most of my time in old houses these years. I don't know, I mean, I'm thrilled, especially with the PMA and the challenges you came in after facing, that institutions are expanding and telling the story to members of underrepresented groups. I think it's perhaps as important that you teach people who aren't a part of those groups that they need to think about that as much. When I wrote the first draft of my book about the park across the street, I was told by a member of the senior National Park Service staff, don't talk to black people about slavery, it just upsets them. And I responded, well, I think most black people know about slavery, and that's not the only thing we're doing here. And, you know, some people have burned the book, but hey, I'm sure it's improved my royalties over the years. But I want to thank you, and I want to also thank the organizers, because so often the public historians go to these things and we never talk about.
So I'm having trouble hearing you, but what
I'm sorry, we never talk about this.
What was the question?
It was more of a statement of thanks at the end of a very long day that for the APS and the Omohundro organizers for bringing this to the public and the importance of public history for the mission we're telling, and to realize that what all this stuff Barbara's been editing, there's an awful lot of interpreters in mop caps or in, I don't know, do the PMA volunteer or still wear vests, but that's the way millions are getting the story beyond anything we write. The Times is important too, no offense, but thank you.
Thank you.
I couldn't quite follow that, but
Yeah.
maybe we'll.
It's a question right
Most
here.
people don't get
Yeah.
public history, it's okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of our days been scholars talking about scholarship, and you all are facing the public, and some of our conversations amongst ourselves have been about that public, something that a lot of scholars don't actually interact with, or they want to and maybe can't figure out how to. So I don't know if you all could talk about the way in which research influences the way that you all operate, and the way the world of scholarship and its influence on how you interpret objects or sites or the work that you do.
Do you want to go first or me?
Go for it.
Okay. So we view scholarship as a multidisciplinary thing. So you have archaeology, you have historic preservationists, we have conservators and conservationists and et cetera that are all thinking deeply about the objects and other things that we have. And then we also think about what are the multifaceted ways that we can get people to connect, whether they're children or adults who look like us or maybe younger, et cetera. And we have to recognize that it's going to be different avenues that connect with people. Some will connect with the written word, some will connect through theater, some may connect through gardens, some may connect through animals, honestly. And so we have to think about how do we use whatever it is going to draw somebody in to make sure that we can then begin to have a journey. And what is fascinating to me about history, and this came through in the research, is the more you learn, the more you want to know. And it's a never-ending journey. And what I mean by that, you can never say you know everything about history. It's something that's got to be continuously explored, unless you're Barbara and you've read every letter that Jefferson's ever done, and every one that Barbara's done. And so what we do is before we do a program, we write scripts, and then those scripts are reviewed by, conservators and historians and et cetera to make sure that what we're showing is accurate and true. And then often after we do the program, we'll do how do we know what we know in terms of what happens and how does this implore. And so we're very rigorous to make sure that everything we do is fact-based and grounded in the research. And so, for example, the person who portrays Jefferson, and I'm going to use Jefferson because we don't have a Ben Franklin. He never came to Williamsburg. Although the Bray School was actually founded at the urging of Benjamin Franklin in Williamsburg. The first one was here in Philadelphia, founded in 1758, and the second was in Williamsburg in 1760. But our person who portrays Jefferson actually has read all those letters. And actually, I was at a program about 2 weeks ago, and somebody said, you wrote a letter to, I forget who it was. And the interpreter has to then say, would it act like they know exactly what was in that letter? And thank you, Barbara, for making sure that he could have that letter. So well done.
Sasha, research.
Yeah.
Well, I think, research is the backbone of these institutions, because we talk a lot about storytelling, and what that really is research brought to life.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And, I was an art historian. I am an art historian, and, confessional in a way. I was a medievalist. So, I spent, a good 5 years of my life studying a single 15th century manuscript that was made in Prague and has since become part of an archdiocese in Girona, Spain. And so, did I know what I was going to do with my life when I took on that project? Probably not. On the other hand, I knew that in the pursuit of knowledge, and most of all, learning from people along the way, that opportunity would come. And I take that same approach to telling stories or sharing research within institutions. These stories can be very esoteric, but when told in an accessible, compelling way, are the very reason why we continue to exist and why people can find purpose in the work we do, but also in their own lives. So I think research is often set up as this, there's this paradigm, it's like research or accessibility, and in fact, it's the two together. And I think, for example, radio has gotten that through podcasts. The more esoteric a story, the more interesting. And somehow, given the access to the visual sense that we have, I think we have a little bit of work to do to catch up. I just think research will never be irrelevant. It just has to continue to be supported and to be brought to life and surfaced.
I think that's a really good wrapping up of our time, actually, that there's no distinction between research and access. They complement one another. They're essential to each other and to the missions that you both are trying to serve. So I think with that, unless there's some other protocol that someone's going to get up here and end our
No, we're
Sounds
going
like-
to.
10 days of proceeding.
I think we're done.
I think we're done. Thank you all.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff.
Thank you.